We are so lucky to welcome back David Epstein to the fan stage for an in-person event. We were discussing the first time David was here. It was on November 2nd, 2016, and let's see if any of you know the significance of that date. Well, it happened to be that it was the 7th game of the World Series that the Cubs won. So I told David he had more people in the green room than were here the night of the 7th game of the World Series. It was, who knew? We did not know. Anyway, so we're glad that he's back and there's more people in the room. David has also done events with us on Zoom. He has also been so gracious as to be an interlocutor with other folks that we have hosted on Zoom. He's just such an excellent human being on so many levels and, good Evanston stock. We love him. He is a science writer and a New York Times bestselling author, and we're thrilled to say that Inside the Box, the book in your hot little hand, has made it to the New York Times bestseller list this week. Yay! We'd like to think we had a tiny little bit to do with that, so yay. And he's also author of The Sports Gene and Range. I think Bookstall had some paperback copies of Range out there. And of course, he is ETHS class of 1998. Yay. Joining him is also another favorite human of ours, is Megan Twohey, also an Evanston alum. She's class of 1994, so the 90s are well represented on the stage tonight. Megan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for the New York Times and co-author with Jodi Kantor of She Said, which takes readers behind the scenes of the Harvey Weinstein investigation and was adapted into a film. We hosted Megan in 2019. I'll make up a date. 2019 sounds about right. Right before COVID, we hosted her for She Said right here. Her investigations have led to greater legal protections for the vulnerable, helped send predators to prison, and sparked public debate. It is my true pleasure to welcome both David Epstein and Megan Twohey, good Evanstonians, back to the stage.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming out this evening. Thank you, Lonnie, for the warm introductions and for putting this awesome event together. It is such a pleasure to be with you, David. I really loved this book, and as I read over it over the past 2 weeks, I started to see certain things in my life and in the world around me in a different light. I was viewing them through the theory, the main point of your book. As you know, I work at the New York Times, and this month, the Times selected what it considers to be the 30 best songwriters of all time. And among those selected was Jay-Z. And as I listened to the Times interview with him, I thought this feels straight out of David's book, especially when Jay-Z talks about how much he loves working within the confines of like a single narrow topic for a song. He said, I feel like I'm my best when I pin myself in the corner. He gives the song lyrical exercise as an example. He says, I'm just gonna take all these references about bars and sit-ups and chin-ups and things, and I'm gonna make it make sense, and it can't be corny. He says it's almost like a cooking show. These are the ingredients I've got to work with. I'm making this type of meal, and that's it. You take one of your arms and you tie it behind your back. It's a challenge, but it's a challenge as a writer that you relish. And when I was listening to him say that, I was like, ding, ding, ding. Can you explain how this comment from one of the best rappers, one of the best songwriters, at least according to the New York Times, fits with what you've found and what you've written in this book?
Yeah, that's very apt, and I appreciate that. I'm glad you enjoyed the book, because I think of you as putting certain constraints on other people in society. But that is very apt, and I would say he's kind of describing, in a practical sense, what some psychologists call the green eggs and ham effect, which was named for Theodore Geisel, aka Dr. Seuss, who was bet that he couldn't, by a publisher, that he couldn't write a book using only 50 words. And that became Green Eggs and Ham, right? Because his hand was tied behind his back, he couldn't experiment with vocabulary, so he had to experiment with this rollicking rhythm that he developed. And actually, even before that, he was asked, I was reading children's literature before him, and it was super literal and mostly really boring, like Johnny ties his shoe, Johnny goes to school. And he was given a vocabulary list and asked to pick about 200 words and write a book with it. And so what does he do? He looks at the list, and he sees there are barely any adjectives, so he starts complaining. He says to his wife, it's like trying to make a strudel without any strudels, which I thought was like a very Seussian thing to say.
Yes, it is.
And then he throws up his hands and says, you know what, I'm just going to take the first 2 rhyming words on the list and write a book. And the first 2 rhyming words on the list were cat and hat, right?
Yeah.
And that's where he decided he had to experiment with this rhythm. And this shows up all over creativity research where, I mean, there are studies that are almost exactly what he was describing, where he said he takes these few ingredients, I'm going to take bars and sit-ups, and where people will be asked to make like mechanical inventions. And if they're given a set of 100 pieces that they can use and told to make anything, what they make is really uncreative. And then if they're said, you have to use these 20 pieces and make a piece of furniture, they become much more creative. The 20 pieces from that set of 100. Now, if it goes so far that they say you can only use these 20 pieces and you have to make a chair, then creativity dips again. But the reason that this open field doesn't produce the creativity that it seems like it should is that, well, as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham puts it, you may think your brain is made for thinking, but it's actually made for preventing you from having to think whenever possible, because thinking is energetically costly. And so if the paths of convenience are open to you, you will only reach for the easy thing, which is usually a solution that's familiar or it's just convenient. And you will skip the hard work of doing something new. So the best way to make someone creative is actually to do something that blocks the solution that would be most familiar or most convenient for them, or as psychologists call it, a desirable difficulty. Like, it may not feel great, but it actually brings the best out of you.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you use yourself as a case study throughout the book in various ways. And the first time is when you talk about an experience you had here in Evanston in 8th grade, if I remember correctly.
Haven Middle School.
Yeah, and at the time you played football really well, and your life gets totally upended when you break your arm during a game. And I think you were the quarterback. Is that right?
Yeah. Although, since it was schoolyard football, I was throwing the kickoff. But yeah, I was playing quarterback,
okay,
yes.
Sorry, yes, let's get our facts correct. Okay, and at first
Very
glance,
important.
Very important. And at first glance, it looks like a huge setback, and in many ways it is. Like, your arm is in a cast from your shoulder to your hand and strapped to your torso.
Yeah.
Jay-Z is using one arm strapped behind his back metaphorically, but your case was literal.
Literal, strapped to my stomach.
And heading into your first year of high school here at ETHS, you can't play football, you can't play sports of any kind, which had been, you're like your real love. And yet this broken arm, this constraint, leads you to grow in new and unexpected ways. Can you explain what happened?
Yeah, and to just clarify the injury, I threw the ball really hard at Haven, and my arm broke on the follow-through of the throw. Like, nobody touched me. I've only ever seen this happen once before to a major league pitcher, and he had to have his arm amputated. So we'll never know why exactly this happened.
It was very gruesome to
It was
read
very
about,
gruesome.
I'll say.
It was very gruesome. Since it had totally separated from my shoulder, I was like turning my shoulder and thinking my hand was somewhere that it wasn't. And I was devastated, right, because my life revolved around sports, and I was not very interested in school at the time. But it did something that constraints often do, which is it forced me to explore in ways that I never would have otherwise, academically and athletically. So academically, at Haven I had French class, which was like my least favorite class. And the tests would be, you had to listen to a French speaker, speaking in real time on a recording, and you'd have a worksheet, and it had blanks, and you had to listen, you had to hear the speaker well enough to fill in the blanks with whatever word they said. And I was mediocre at this. And when I broke my arm, I couldn't use my writing hand. And so I realized I couldn't keep up. So I started trying to memorize the words as they went by, and then slowly going back and writing with my left hand. And I started acing these tests. And I started using mnemonic devices. I didn't know that word at the time, but I would relate it to some sports thing in my head and create a story, and I could remember all the words. 30 years later, I would read one of the most famous studies ever done on memory, where a Carnegie Mellon undergrad was taken from being able to memorize 7 digits in a row to 80 digits, random digits, using sports-related mnemonics. And this became a key part of my academic life, where I would use, so I can still, like, if I give an hour-long keynote talk, I'll memorize every word of it.
Wow.
And I'll feel free to ad-lib off of that, but I have it memorized. And so I often get asked, do I have a photographic memory? If I put my keys down and spin in a circle, I lose them. Like, I do not have a photographic memory. But it forced me to come up with these strategies I wouldn't have explored. And athletically, because I was barred from contact sports for a long time, I ran cross-country just to try to stay in shape. And I was like, this isn't a real sport. Like, you don't run into anybody, you know? And it turned out I loved a coach I had. I don't know if he's here anywhere, but he called me, said maybe he'd be here. But I loved the coach, I loved the guys, and this feeling of tangible improvement. Then I went back to other sports, football, basketball, baseball, but it stuck in my head. And when I ceased to grow and wanted to play college sports, I turned back to running, and it became one of the most important things in my life. I mean, I became a Division I runner, I became a university record holder. It's something I still do most days in my life. And it's just not something I would have explored. Like, I'm not saying that running had to turn out to be the greatest thing, but I would not have explored as much as I should have if I had not had this restriction from the things that came most easily to me.
Yeah. One of the things I really value about your book is that you're not just delivering big ideas, you're illustrating them through really rich and specific stories that take the reader all over the world into all different professions and bring us face to face with a variety of historical and present-day figures. You know, your book covers scientists, tech innovators, athletes, musicians, writers. And one of my favorite stories is about the American jazz musician Keith Jarrett and how he came to perform one of the most innovative and celebrated songs in music history at a concert at the Cologne Opera House in Germany in the 1970s. Can you tell us what happened on that particular night?
Yeah, I loved this story. I realized in the course of writing books that I would have loved to be a historian, because whenever I'm doing the historical stories, I just love it. And in this case, this young woman, this teenager named Vera Brandis, this German woman, was promoting concerts in Cologne because she wanted people in Cologne to see music from around the world. And her biggest concert was going to be with Keith Jarrett, this virtuoso jazz pianist who she'd seen play with Miles Davis. And she rents out the opera house. You know, it's more than 1,000 seats. It's going to be this big concert. Jarrett shows up. He's famously ornery, right? He would stop a concert if he heard the click of a camera or a cough, or sometimes dress down the audio engineer from the stage. So, you know, he's a bit of a diva. And he shows up at the venue. He's on this huge, you know, different country every week kind of tour. And he plays the piano at the venue, hits a few keys, and says, "Concert's off." And Vera's like, "What are you talking about? It's sold out." He said, "Wrong piano." Not only was the piano not tuned, right brand, it wasn't tuned, the felt hammers were worn out. It had fewer keys than the piano that he had asked for, which is pretty unusual. I didn't even really know that concert pianos came with different numbers of keys. And so he gets in a car and starts driving. First, she starts scrambling, actually. She calls the local university and asks, "Do you have a Bosendorfer Imperial?" Meaning that's the kind of piano she was supposed to get. They had one. She was one other in Cologne. And she says, "Can I please borrow it?" It was her friend's dad. All right. It's raining, so she gets a bunch of her school friends, says she's going to throw a towel over it, a blanket, and wheel it across the central square of Cologne. And the piano tuner who showed up says, like, "Do you have 40 grand? Because if you wheel it across that square, you're going to have to buy a new piano."
Yeah, this was like when my heart started to race as you were
So they're stuck.
telling the story.
And she sees Keith Jarrett driving away. He sends the audio engineering team home, and she runs up to the car and opens the door and swears at him, says something she had heard Miles Davis say on stage to his bandmates, not even really knowing what it meant, that involved a curse word, and says, you know, "Please do this." And he stares back at her and says, "One time only, just for you." Maybe because she was this teenager who was in distress, who knows?
Yeah.
But he decides to do it, plays on this piano that's too small, it's worn out. The tuner gets it in shape the best he can, But Jared has to stay away from the upper register of keys because it's tinny. There's other parts of the piano he avoids. It's too small for the theater, so he's to add a percussive element. He starts banging his foot against the pedal without pressing it down. And he improvises for an hour. Decided, since the audio recording team was there, he decided whatever, they could stay. Goes off to the next country, never thinks about it again. After like several standing ovations. And then it starts getting played in record stores as background music, because it's an hour long. It's too long to go on the radio. And people, when they hear it, they say, "What is this?"
Yeah.
And it starts selling and selling and selling until it becomes the best-selling solo piano album of all time.
Yeah.
And totally from word of mouth. And as Jarrett says, this imperfect piano just forced me to find something new. So sometimes he'll spend minutes at a time doing the same thing with his left hand, staying in the only area that works, and then improvising with his right. And it is just a beautiful, beautiful piece of music. And he said it through his career a few times where he'd find a piano with this imperfect character and be pissed. But then it would drive him to some space he couldn't have imagined in advance.
Yeah, yeah. You also write about Virginia Woolf, who has been hailed as one of the godmothers of modern literature. She's one of my favorite authors.
Oh, good. Nobody has asked me about Virginia Woolf.
Yeah, and I remember how blown away when I was when I first started reading her work, in which she tells stories through the interior lives of her characters. She was smashing traditional narration and structure of novels, working with what felt like an entirely new and exciting creative freedom. And yet, as you point out, in order to achieve this major breakthrough or innovation in literary form, Woolf had to work within specific boundaries and constraints. In fact, a lot of the famous modern artists and writers did as well.
Yeah, and let me tell a quick reporting story about Virginia Woolf because I thought it was fun, where I wanted to see. So, actually, I'll get into it. So Virginia Woolf, for more than what turned out to be the first half of her life, was a good writer, but was writing traditional novels. And her last sort of traditional novel is very, very good, but she gets criticized by one of her authorial rivals who says it's great, it's tidy, she's an excellent writer, but it's like a ship that left port and came back with an absence of any scars. Like, it just doesn't have a heart. And Virginia Woolf, she writes in her diary, she knows it's right. Like, she can feel that there's something wrong because life has gotten more complex around her. World War I happened, empires fell, women took on different roles in society, science and religion started taking on different roles, the world started being more international, all these things had happened. And they weren't represented in modern novels, which were super tidy. What Woolf she would write these essays trying to define modern novels, and she would call her peers the materialists, where you described character by exactly what they were wearing and what their house looked like and all these things. And so she wrote these essays defining the status quo, including her own work, and then said, "I'm blocking that." So this is what the psychologist Patricia Stokes, who studies artistic innovation, calls a preclude constraint, where you define the status quo and then you block yourself from it. So she said, "I'm not going to use all-knowing narration anymore." And she starts experimenting with these short stories where she says, every time I'm going to try a different narration. One of the short stories, she says, the narrative viewpoint is from a flower bed in a public park, and it'll just catch snippets as people walk by.
Yeah.
And she keeps trying these different tools, and when she writes this short story called An Unwritten Novel, where it's a guy on a train seeing this middle-aged woman who has physical tics, and he conjures in his head this whole story of some crime that she committed, and she's had these guilty tics ever since, and she's on the run, and she's a loner. And then when the train stops, she's like greeted warmly by her son, who takes her away, and the mayor's like, "I was totally wrong." But it's about this attempt to read other people that's always unsuccessful, and she develops this style of narration where even the narrator doesn't fully know the character. The characters don't often fully know themselves. And so she basically invents what we now call the stream of consciousness, right? And it was putting herself, so she did what Patricia Stokes calls, so when Stokes studied the history of artistic innovation, she found a theme that she called paired constraints. The first step is preclude, where you define the status quo and you block it, and the next step is promote, where you find a new thing that you're going to try in its place. So a classic example is like Claude Monet, where At the time, painters would use light and dark shades to portray light and mix paint with black to make it darker. And Monet said, no black, no more dark and light. So thoroughly that at his funeral, when they put a black shroud over his coffin, one of his friends freaked out and started yelling, no black for Monet. And he went in and got a floral tablecloth and draped it over the coffin. But so Monet said, no light and dark shades, no black. I'm going to use just pure colors. That's the promote, next to one another to try to display any impression of light. And that was the birth of Impressionism. So it's these paired constraints. And in the reporting on Woolf, because I wanted to see how she did this, I wanted access to her notebooks. So they have them at the New York Public Library. And I had to beg them, because I would ask, I really want to see her notebooks. And they'd say, well, we have it on microfilm. You have to be in this one certain room even to see it on microfilm. Wow. And I said, I may want to physically describe them. Could you please take them out? So you have to get all these approvals and everything. Amazing. And they someone with gloves, and they turn the page for you. And I could see her first modernist novel was this one called Jacob's Room, and she writes it kind of traditionally and then starts crossing stuff out. So when you read the book, there's a lot of things you don't know, and you have to guess about Jacob. It's all this interior novel, and he goes off and he dies in World War I. You don't even find out that he's the main character, that he dies until the last page when his mother is trying to figure out what to do with the shoes from his room. And you could see her having written a normal novel and then going and crossing out the normal stuff and making something new. So it's this incredible drive to innovate through this process of blocking and putting something else in its place.
Yeah, I just thought that was so fascinating, and what an amazing find. I mean, that must have just been so thrilling to see.
Loved
that
it.
in the...
Obviously, as a writer, sometimes I also use this book as an excuse to shadow Isabel Allende, right?
Yes,
It's
I noticed
my own interests show up a little bit.
But, before we move on from writers, I want to ask about Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
I didn't realize this, but apparently some of his most famous speeches had language and maybe even entire passages that were originally written by others.
Yeah.
But as you point out, it was common practice for pastors to draw on each other's work when crafting sermons. And it's actually one of the reasons that King's writing resonated with so many people. Yeah. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, and this, by the way, was a tricky thing to write, because I couldn't write about this without also addressing his academic plagiarism, basically. Yeah. But you want to put it in the proper context. Yeah. So King grew up in the folk preaching tradition, where the idea of preaching to the choir, which we sometimes say is a bad thing, was a good thing.
Was a good thing, right.
The people expected to hear the hits. Yeah. And actually excessive originality was seen as suspicious. And that's what he learned. But he also had radical ideas that he wanted people to accept, that he wanted white Christians to accept. Right. And so what he would do was use these strategies where he would start sermons with material that he knew the audience already found positively irrefutable. That was often because they had already heard it from someone they had endorsed. So he would take passages from pastors who had radio shows that preached to millions, use this and he would use a strategy called typology, where you start with something irrefutable, and then you find that historical type through history. So you start with Moses, liberator of slaves. Then you get to Abraham Lincoln, liberator of slaves. Then Gandhi, liberator from colonialism. Supreme Court, with Brown versus Board of Education, liberator. And then to you in the audience, who can carry on this torch today. And so in all of his sermons, there's this mix of stuff that's basically copied and familiar, and then these rhetorical gut punches that he slips in. So he was kind of like a musician who's doing a cover, but making it his own. And the more radical a passage he wanted to share, the more conventional would be the stuff he hitched it to. So in one of his famous speeches, he shares this anecdote about how chemists had calculated that if you broke down the human body, it would amount to raw material worth 98 cents. And then he says, can you reduce Shakespeare to 98 cents? Can you reduce Einstein to 98 cents? And that was such a cliche that readers of Christian Century magazine had actually voted that it be retired from sermons when he used it, but they agreed with it. And because he put it right by this point where he talks about a religion that doesn't care about the physical beings and material well-being of people in slums is a dry, do-nothing, dead religion that deserves the criticism of the Marxists because it's just an opiate of the masses. So it's like this blow your hair back rhetoric, and people are stunned. And then he returns to the thing that they're like, oh, the comfortable thing. And he would do this, mixing the radical with the conventional to get white Protestants to basically see the demand for justice as irrefutable. And it turns out, with any radical idea, whether it's a product or a revolution, the more you can hook it, the more you can ground a vision of change in a vision of continuity, the more likely people are to accept it.
Yeah, it seemed like he was using sort of the constraints of the familiar to draw people in and then deliver these like new, more radical ideas, which I just thought was so interesting and such a testament to his savvy and brilliance. Yeah.
And you see it everywhere. So it's even forgotten, like the let freedom ring crescendo. He took that, his friend Archibald Carey had used that in a speech in 1952, and Archibald Carey had taken it from Ida B. Wells, who used it earlier. And so they were just repurposing this stuff. Even now, if you go to the National Mall and the King Memorial and Monument, there are great quotes of his etched into the granite, and one of them that's the most famous is, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And the second part is his, and the first part is another preacher named J. Wallace Hamilton. So even his famous quotes on Memorial, he would mix his thing with somebody else's.
Yeah.
And this design is all around us, by the way. It's called, in digital design, it's called skeuomorphism, where the folders look like a folder on your computer because it's trying to communicate to you that there's a continuity of what this thing is for, or why your electric vehicle plugs into the place where there's no gas tank, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go into the tech and business world. Can you tell us the story of a company called General Magic, which at one point was seemingly the most promising tech venture in the world, and yet I'm suspecting that most of us in this room tonight have never heard of it?
Yeah, I like to think of it as the most important company nobody's ever heard of. Not important because of what they did, but the people that came out of it. So General Magic was the first so-called concept IPO in Silicon Valley history, where they went public just with an idea. Goldman Sachs took them public with an idea because it was so visionary, not a product. Like, what could go wrong, right?
Yeah.
And it was founded by 3 former Apple employees, 2 of whom had designed the original Mac, and one, this guy Mark Peratt, whose job at Apple had been seeing the future of technology. And he was an absolute visionary. Like, I read his PhD dissertation in reporting 1976 at Stanford, and he coins the term information economy on the first page, and he sees the future. Not just the promise of connecting the world, but problems with misinformation, rising inequality, copyright issues. Like, he saw what was coming. And so in 1989, in his notebook, he sketches a thin glass rectangle with no protruding buttons and a touchscreen with rectangular apps on it, and labels it remote-a-phone pewter.
The iPhone. He's like envisioning the iPhone.
The web did not exist yet.
It blows my mind.
And so he draws this incredible talent to him. Companies from all over the world invest. They build this huge alliance of communications tech companies around the world that's so big that their meetings have to start with an antitrust lawyer telling them all the things they're not allowed to talk about. And talent pours in, money pours in, and they can do anything. And so they do anything. Like, every good idea someone has, they start doing, and it grows and grows and grows. And it becomes totally incoherent. Like, they didn't define a clear customer. They called their customer Joe Sixpack, and nobody knew who that was. So they end up just building like crazy. And when the thing comes out way late, nobody knows. It has so much. It has a 200-page manual, right? Joe Sixpack doesn't do a 200-page manual. And nobody knows how to use it. It's a complete flop, disaster. Like, the stock price doubled on the first day. The company's worthless within 2 years. And I think the emblematic interview that showed the problem of too much freedom and too many resources was with this engineer named Steve Perlman, whose job was to write a calendar app. And he writes it to go from 1904 to 2096 and checks it in and thinks he's done. And then a team leader comes to him and says, Steve, you got to make this thing, somebody might write a historical app. You got to make this thing bigger. So he opens it up and writes it to go from year 1 to the future. Checks it in, thinks he's done. Then another team comes to him. Steve, why are you tying this into an arbitrary religious context? You should go back to the beginning of astronomical time. So he writes a calendar app to go from the Big Bang to the future.
Yeah.
It would have been 4 lines of code if he stuck with 1904 to 2096. Instead, it took months because they had unlimited resources.
Yeah.
They could do anything. So
Right.
they did. As the venture capitalist Bill Gurley told me, more startups die of indigestion than starvation. Too much, not too little.
Right. Yeah. It was incredible. You know, you just sort of become more and more uncomfortable reading through like how inefficient they were. All these brilliant minds.
Well,
I mean, some of the like these folks went on to work
Oh, yeah.
so much more efficiently after this.
Oh.
But what a massive failure it was to have all of this like boundless opportunities and resources.
I probably interviewed maybe 40 employees of General Magic, and probably 3/4 of them said some version of, I just couldn't figure out what not to do.
Yeah.
But the people that came out of it, especially the younger people, were scarred in a very useful way, where they ended up building Android, iPhone, iPod, LinkedIn, Apple Watch, Safari. They had eBay internally. They had a low-level service engineer who started a site called Auction Web and was like, look what I'm doing, guys. Do you want it? No, too small. Okay, so he took it out, and that became eBay. They had the Palm Pilot internally. But the most scarred guy was this guy, Tony Fadell, because these were idols to him. And he became a zealot for constraints. So he went on to lead the design of the iPod. And then he's kind of anti-iPhone now, which is very interesting. But even because he was one of the designers. But then he co-founded the smart thermostat company Nest, and he forced the team to work inside a literal box where he made them prototype the packaging before the product, because he said, this is what we have to communicate to the end user. If it doesn't fit on this box, it's not a priority.
Yeah. Yeah. So I also want to round the corner into sports. And here I want to cite an example of another thing I've sort of started to see differently in my own life after reading your book, and that's my 9-year-old daughter's softball team. This season has come with a huge change. Up until now, my daughter has played on teams in which coaches pitch, and now the players are the ones doing the pitching. And if I'm being honest, it's a total mess. The first inning of the last game last weekend took no less than a half an hour because there were so many walks. There were no hits, no fielding. It was all pitching. Bad pitching. And yet, at her team practices, they don't acknowledge the outside role of pitching. The vast majority of time is devoted to regular throwing and catching and hitting. Very little time is spent on pitching, even though without decent pitching, the players don't get to do any of the other stuff. And the team won't improve. In fact, it won't get to really play in any meaningful way. And this may seem like a stretch, but the whole situation has made me think of an Olympic swimmer that you write about in your book, Sheila, am I pronouncing it?
Taormina.
Taormina. And you use her as an example in a chapter titled Target the Bottleneck. And can you explain who she is and what a bottleneck is and how it fits into the broader theory of constraints?
Sure, and if you want, we could also talk separately about something called the constraints-led approach to sports skill development, which is really having a moment. It's been around for a long time, but it's having a moment because Victor Wembanyama and Shohei Ohtani and Kelsey Plum have been talking about it publicly. And it sounds like your daughter's team could use some of it.
Yes, well, I'm hoping that I can leave here
okay.
tonight and go to her team and say I've got David Epstein and endorsed feedback from the team.
But I'm going to tell the Sheila Taormina story, and we can come back to that. So Sheila was a swimmer at the University of Georgia in 1992. She tries to make the Olympic team in the 200-meter freestyle. Doesn't make it, isn't really close, decides to retire. But for one of her last 2 classes at Georgia, she takes Management 577, and in it she learns about something called the theory of constraints, which is this idea, it was started by this Israeli physicist who was studying chicken coop production for a friend. And what he found in studying the chicken coop, it was just like a small assembly line, basically. And what he saw was that his friend was adding people to the assembly line process, and it wasn't producing more coops. His friend was like, what's going on? And what Goldratt found was that there was always a single slowest step that limited overall production. So it didn't matter how fast the other steps were working, because the whole system could only work at the speed of the slowest step. And this became the core of his theory of constraints, which is the idea that every system is limited by a single slowest step, or the bottleneck.
The pitchers in 9-year-old softball.
The pitchers are the bottleneck here. With a half-hour-long first inning, I'm surprised that the patience of the parents didn't become the bottleneck in there. But so Sheila is really intrigued by this idea and decides, I'm going to, for my class project, write a plan to drop 3 seconds in the 200-meter freestyle using the theory of constraints. So she does an audit of her training and decides her bottleneck is strength or power. She's only 5'2", which is quite small for an elite swimmer. And she has an incredible aerobic engine, but that's all she's working on. Her coaches have her doing only aerobic stuff, so she's getting better at this thing she's incredible at, and it's not her limiting factor, so it's not making a difference. So she goes and she has trouble finding other coaches because they don't see her potential for the national team, but she finally finds a coach that will work with her and target strength, her bottleneck, sacrifice some of the work on aerobic where she's already great. And 4 years later, she goes back to the Olympic trials, swims 3 seconds faster, makes the team, wins an Olympic gold medal as part of the relay. If you Google her, Sheila Taormina, you'll see her with the relay team. She's about 10 inches shorter than the other 3 members of the relay team. And then she retires again. And then for health, she starts doing some triathlons. And she has this new approach to training where she always targets what's the limiting factor. And she wins the U.S. national championships in the triathlon, goes to the Olympics, finishes 6th, goes to the Olympics again, retires again. And she comes out of retirement again and learns fencing and horse jumping, and goes to the Olympics again in modern pentathlon. She becomes the only woman ever to have competed in 3 different sports in 4 Summer Olympics. And she was going to retire if she hadn't come across this management concept of targeting her bottleneck, which is very similar for me, by the way. I was a walk-on runner. I didn't know this language, but recovery was my bottleneck. I could not recover as fast as other 800-meter runners. And so the plan, with the help of an assistant coach, became for me to schedule class over 1 workout a week so I had an excuse not to show up. And that worked like rocket fuel, and I ended up as like a university record holder. So this idea of targeting the bottleneck is often overlooked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm emboldened to go back to softball practice.
Do you want to talk about the constraints-led approach for
yes,
softball?
yes.
Okay, I'll give you the quick upshot.
Yeah.
So normal practice in sports is called blocking training, where you show someone how to do something, they do it a gazillion times. Constraints-led approach conceives of the coach or trainer as an environment architect, where their point is to set up constraints that force the learner to do what they call in the lingo self-organize, or find the best solution given their unique physiology and psychology. So the first time I saw this was at an Olympic Development Swim Club in Australia, where they had the kids, instead of saying, you do this with your arm, they put hoops in the water and they had to swim through without touching, and it forced them to get in as linear as a position as possible. So for softball, for this pitching, I would start by like moving, if they can't hit the strike zone, clearly, I would start by moving them closer and putting obstacles that they have to throw between, and then move them back just a little bit at a time, and how can you avoid these obstacles, instead of just making it this open challenge of throwing at the plate. Because probably what you want them to do is aim a lot smaller than they're aiming right now.
Yeah. Well, and I think at the very least, we just need to increase the amount of time. Like, it's like not all things can be created equal when one thing is really like driving everything
Certainly.
else.
Yeah.
So, anyway, okay. So, as I've read your book, I thought about the different types of constraints that I've experienced in my career as a journalist. Like when I was, I think, 22, I took a job at the English language newspaper in Moscow, and I moved to Russia. But there were a couple problems, which was that I didn't speak Russian and there were no translators on staff.
Details.
Details. But I was 22. I was, queen of the world. I knew what I was doing. And I always, since then, have described it as like working with one arm behind my back. And not in a good way, like it was for you and Jay-Z. Like the language barrier was too much of a constraint, and it was so hard to do my job, almost impossible, and I was miserable. Like I didn't last a year. But I've also experienced good restraints, especially in the form of deadlines. Jodie Cantor and I had been investigating the Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein for several months, and intended to keep reporting for several more months, when one of our sources told us that Ronan Farrow was working on a similar investigation for The New Yorker. even worse, they were likely weeks away from publishing their story. And it was like the equivalent of a massive alarm going off. Jody, yes, Jody and I wanted to report the story to the fullest extent possible, but more importantly, we didn't want to get beat. And the things that we had learned, so we basically we flipped open our computer, and we did a timeline in which we put in basically all of our findings of our reporting so far. And in black were the things that were totally off the record and we didn't think we had a chance of getting on the record. And the things in red were the things that we either had on the record or we thought were we had a good chance of getting into a publishable form. And in the next 2 weeks, we focused only on those. And 2 weeks later, we got this, we published the story, we had a story to publish. And we beat Ronan by 2 days, and the story landed. And it wasn't the story that we would have hoped to have done if we had more months to accomplish it. But the story had a pretty big impact. It was a pretty good story.
So I've heard.
But this is just to say that, we remained in these are long examples to serve this point that not all constraints are created equal. In my experience, the language constraint limited what I was able to accomplish, whereas the deadlines in competition of the Weinstein story, those helped to accelerate and sharpen my work. And so how do you distinguish between good and bad constraints?
Yeah, it's very tough. I mean, and let me comment on something interesting that you did with that red and black system, which is one of the, to some degree, the word constraint is practically synonymous with something you don't want, right, as a frustrating situation. And my hope was that to give an emotional reframe for limits to people, because two of the major things they can do, we've talked about launching you into productive exploration, but also force you to clarify priorities. So what you did there was a very serious clarification of priorities, right? And actually deadlines have been shown to they can either improve or harm people's problem solving, and it actually depends if they use them to clarify priorities and start doing a lot of monotasking. Whereas if the deadline is so tight that it drives them to think they have to multitask, then it actually really harms their problem solving. So you want a deadline, but you also want to be kind of protected in a way and do this serious prioritization. So that's a great thing. I think the difference sometimes is, if you say, could I still surprise myself? And the answer is no, where you can't even communicate, then you're way too constrained. So one of the first readers of this book was a guy named Ed Hoffman, who was the first chief knowledge officer at NASA, kind of like a head psychologist. And he said, I have to tell you about this mission called L-Cross, right, where these engineers ended up with about half the time and money that they wanted. And so what'd they do? Well, first they whined. And then they said, if we were going to get this done anyway, how would we do it? And they said, we can't build from scratch. So they borrowed imaging equipment from Army tanks and engine temperature sensors from NASCAR. And they built a probe that confirmed water on the moon. And so it's a great constraint story, and borrowing technology became part of their work in general. Now, Ed said, had they been restricted to a quarter of the budget, it would have just failed.
Yeah.
Right? So the question is what is too much?
Right.
And that, I think, is very difficult to say, except for in these studies of creative problem solving, when people are prescribed what to do and very much how to do it, then it's a lot of the benefits go way downhill.
Yeah. You weave some of this into the book, but can you tell us how you applied what you learned to the execution of your book?
Oh,
and
sure.
also just in your life more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, there was, my publisher told me to stop using this word, but whatever, me-search. There's a lot of me-search in this book. They said, it'll make people think that the book's not for them, it's just about you. I swear I'm not in most chapters at all. But I was writing a book that I needed. There's a reason it's been 7 years between my books, because I'm terrible at putting boundaries around my own projects. For my first 2 books, I wrote 50% over the length of the book and then had to cut it back to get a book. So for Sports Gene, I took a trip to Arctic Sweden that I had to cut. Once you have a kid, you don't want to be taking trips to Arctic Sweden that's not going in the book.
No, you're not.
And so this time around, because I was like General Magic, everything I thought was interesting goes in. And then you realize, oh, there's actually a page limit, I have to cut it back. So this time I didn't start writing for a year, really, at all, just research, interviewing. And then I generated this 100,000 word note sheet and printed it out and read every page of it. And as soon as I was finished with that, I said, I'm making a structural outline on one page and one page only. And if it's not on that page, it did not go in the book. And that forced me to ruthlessly prioritize. So there's plenty of interesting things that didn't make it, but I wanted to pick the things I thought were most interesting. And it forced me to experiment with the structure to make it a little more coherent. So this is the first book where I have thematically linked chapters and this recurring story from the introduction that comes through it. And so that was kind of my version of like Tony Fidel's box at Nest. I kind of took this from him. He said the most important advice he gives entrepreneurs is to write the press release before they start the project, because it forces you to define the problem you think you're solving. And it's kind of painful and annoying, but really useful. So those were kind of the work constraints that I put on myself for this project.
What about other constraints? I mean, you talked about the constraint of having kids.
Yeah.
You know, like there's, how else do you feel like you've seen the value of constraints either kind of play out in your life looking back, given what you now know, versus like things that you are also maybe actively applying to your life?
Yeah, I mean, so many of the good things in my life have come out of constraints, whether it was the broken arm or when I was a science student, I lived on a ship in the Pacific Ocean and learned how to work out with like no space and no equipment. I still do that to this day, especially if I'm in a hotel. And then I lived in a tent, basically a glorified tent in the Arctic, and realized I don't like having too much stuff, you know? And having a kid, of course, is a constraint. I used to think one of my competitive advantages was that I would let my workday swallow up every moment of my life. That's just not possible when the kid walks in the door. And I actually think I'm better for it because I don't know why I wasn't thinking like an athlete where it's like, it's stress plus rest that equals your growth.
Yeah.
And I wasn't building in the rest. And he kind of forces me to build in this, you know, this rest period and to have another room in my identity house that I can move into so I'm not only focused on writing. And even in my sort of personal life, this is a very privileged thing to say, and actually the Wall Street Journal just reviewed the book and said all these really nice things, except that the reviewer said that she cringed a little when I talked about having too much autonomy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And because I thought that's what I always wanted as a writer. So when I could go independent, I did, and I ended up totally individualizing my schedule in ways that I think were pretty like unhealthy, you know, because I could be on my own schedule all the time, so I never synced up with anybody else. It was like, if you remember Mark Zuckerberg when he first started talking about the metaverse, and he would say, it's going to be great, we're all going to live in a universe tailored just to us.
Yeah.
It's like, that's horrible.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I did to myself. Mm-hmm. And so to try to ground myself back in the world and have, it's really clear that for well-being, you want a dense network of reciprocal obligations. You want obligations to other people, and you want them to have obligations to you. So I joined a nonprofit board in my community where I had to be at a certain place at certain times and donate money in certain cadence. And I started going to dance meetups. So I'd have be somewhere with strangers in an embodied way. And I joined a dinner and discussion club. And all these things that started putting structure back into my schedule that I had lost. And because I think this, some people have too many restrictions in their work life. But this individualization that a lot of us can do, like the Soviet Union tried this in the 1920s. They gave people individualized work schedules, and it was a social calamity. Mm-hmm. So they got rid of it, but like sometimes we're doing it to ourselves now.
Right. Well, and you also talk about, it's whether you're a writer and a journalist working on a book or a story or just a regular, just anybody moving through the world today, we also are just inundated with so much information. There's like, it's basically like you wake up to a complete like tidal wave of, things coming at you online. And
yeah.
I know that you had an interesting statistic about the number of times people check email. So
yes.
I feel like there's something,
That's
even like the ways that you've kind of restricted how often you check
yes.
like there's things that I feel like I now think about that stuff. Try to be more proactive in thinking about those restrictions.
Like, I wake up again and Megan's like telling me how horrible the world is. I can't take it anymore. No, but no, I put restrictions on my focus. So that was the work you're referring to is by this psychologist Gloria Mark, who started studying what people do at work about 25 years ago. And at that time, she found people would switch tasks about every 3 minutes. And then by 2012, it was every 75 seconds. And by 2022, it was every 45 seconds.
Incredible.
And not only is that terrible for your productivity, because as she describes, the brain is like a whiteboard, and when you erase the whiteboard, it leaves a residue that carries over and takes up some of your cognitive bandwidth for the next task, and you do that a bunch of times over the day, and you're just, if you need that cognitive bandwidth, you're in trouble. But now we also know that it really increases your stress, as measured by heart rate variability. You can basically predict someone's end-of-day stress by the number of times they toggle, and she found that the average worker in an office checks emails 77 different times a day. So not 77 emails, 77 different checks.
Right.
And so one of the things to fix this is to try to block your work. So maybe you have to check all those emails, but can you do email in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 blocks where you're just doing email, and then you're doing the next thing and you're just doing that? And it's really hard at first. Like, people have to start with 15 minutes or a half hour of not toggling. Trying to put your phone outside the room.
Yeah.
Because we know that it... So one of the scariest part of her research is she found that because of the way our attention has been trained, that if you say, now I have to focus and be serious, and you put the phone away or the notifications off or whatever, you will self-interrupt with intrusive thoughts at the rate to which you've become accustomed.
Yeah.
As if you have this internal barometer that's saying, I got to check something.
Yeah.
So it will try to keep that cadence. So you want to start with small blocks, put a pad next to you, where when those thoughts of checking come into your head, write them down to cognitively outsource, it's called, and try to build up to longer and longer blocks, because you'll work better and you'll be less stressed.
Yeah. I do something, and I've now started doing it again because it's so easy to fall off, but just like setting my phone, like setting a timer for 45 minutes and saying, like, I'm going to stay focused on this task, and then when 45 minutes is over, I can do 5 minutes of, like bopping around on the internet.
Yeah, Maya Angelou she was famously focused, Maya Angelou.
Right.
When she would rent hotel rooms, she would have them strip even the paintings off the wall.
Yeah.
So she wouldn't be distracted. But she would also bring things like crossword puzzles, and she called it toggling between her big mind and her little mind, which is basically a perfect encapsulation of what cognitive scientists later, she was like just ahead of the neuroscientists, that your attention's also like a bucket, and you want to take a break before it fills up and do something kind of rote to replenish.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I do that now. I find that I also do that with when I work from home. Like, I'll cook. I'll like take a break to cook or do the laundry, and there's actually something. It feels like a nice break from my mind and then refreshing. But anyway, I want to. We're coming up on on 8 o'clock, and I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions. But I want to end my questions for you, David. I mean, we had before the. I mean, we both grew up here, and we don't live here anymore. You live in Washington, D.C. I live in New York. And I'm just curious, we had, before the event tonight, we just walked around the high school and got to see, the gym and the pool and all these old places from our past. I'm curious, I want to sort of share one place that I always like to visit in Evanston when I come home, and why I think it also fits with your book. But I'm just curious, when you come back, what are there particular places or favorite spots that like you love to return to?
Yes, although you saw one of the first spots that comes to mind, which is not a happy place.
Oh, yeah.
Which is in the field house. Like, I visit the spot where one of my teammates and friends died at the end of a race here. And that's what led to my career in science writing, where I wanted to write about sudden cardiac death in athletes. And that's how I became the science writer at Sports Illustrated. And it's a poignant spot to visit. Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, the older I get, when I was like doing something and writing about it, I felt active, and the older I get, like in some ways, the more tricky it is to think about, I guess, a little bit. Yeah. But yeah, it's poignant. It's a good, memento mori reminder, like the Stoics say, is talk about a constraint, is the Stoics say, you should wake up every day and remember your mortality, and that will really help you clarify your priorities.
Yeah.
So that's a place I visit, but also the lakefront. I mean, I love going for a run along the lakefront, because that's when I was discovering running, what I was doing, this thing that I thought was temporary that became this real passion.
Yeah.
And also, it's really flat here, so I'm much faster than I am at home. So I'll be like a minute a mile faster. I'm like, wow. Fantastic, straight along the lakefront. So I love that, like out by the Northwestern Rocks and everything, and it's just...
Did you run there today?
I did.
I was walking. I did a walk along the lakefront, and I was thinking, I bet David Epstein is out here for a run.
Yeah, I was out there.
That my theory was correct.
I was there twice today. I went to run and a walk with my dad.
Yeah.
But I feel like a strong sense of nostalgia in a lot of places around here. Yeah. So what's a favorite place for you?
Okay, well, this is not as serious, but whenever I'm home and I grew up not too far from Mustard's Last Stand.
Oh, yeah.
And I still like to go there, and now when I come home with my husband and my daughter, we go there. And I have to say, now when I think about Mustard's, I think about it in a different light, and I wonder if the constraints of such a small space help explain how they've been able to produce such amazing hot dogs and French fries for decades.
I think there's something to be said for the small space. Like this is more like, maybe this will sound like highfalutin or whatever, but I remember when one of my favorite living writers, a playwright who would write his plays set in the west of Ireland, and so the first time sort of in my adult life that I went to an international on my own, I went to those little islands that he would write about, and I went to one that nobody ever visits, and there was one bar, so everyone had to go there. So you could see this incredible slice of humanity because everyone packed into the same place. And I think it's so rare now that, you have people from all walks of life and perspectives and socioeconomic status that are sort of forced to be packed in certain places.
Yeah.
And where that happens, I think it's really special.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David. I know that
Thank you.
many of you also